The year is 1172. A Venetian fleet of 120 ships sails toward Constantinople on a mission of revenge. The Byzantine emperor has just imprisoned thousands of Venetian merchants and seized their property. Venice, the wealthiest trading city in Europe, cannot let this stand. So the government does something unprecedented. It taxes every citizen based on their wealth, not a voluntary contribution, a forced extraction. The promise? We'll crush the Byzantines, rescue our people, seize their treasure, and pay you back with the spoils. It was a complete disaster. Plague swept through the fleet. Thousands died on ships that never saw combat. Only about a quarter of those who sailed out ever returned. And when the Doge, the leader of Venice, stepped off his ship, an angry mob chased him through the streets and killed him. The government now faced an impossible problem. They owed their citizens an enormous sum. They had no way to pay it back. And the people were furious enough to murder their own leader. So Venice invented something new, something that would change financial history for the next 800 years. They invented the government bond. Welcome to the Ledger Chronicle, where the vault of history unlocks the secrets of money and power. Let's be clear about what existed before 1172. Kings borrowed money, emperors borrowed money. But there was a fundamental problem with royal debt. Repayment depended entirely on the monarch's whim. If he won his war, maybe he'd pay you back. Maybe he wouldn't. If he died, his successor might refuse to honor the debt entirely. This wasn't theoretical. Edward III of England borrowed massive sums from Florentine banking families. When he defaulted, the great houses of Bardi and Peruzzi collapsed. Generations of wealth, gone. Because they lent to a king who broke his promise. Venice was different. Venice wasn't ruled by a king. It was a merchant republic, governed by its wealthy elite. The Doge was elected, constrained by councils, and as that mob in 1172 demonstrated, accountable. When Venice borrowed from its citizens, the creditors were the same people who ran the government. They were lending money to themselves. This created alignment. So here's what Venice did after the disaster. The government couldn't pay back the forced loans immediately, but they could promise regular interest payments, roughly 5% annually, paid consistently until the principal could eventually be repaid. They called these obligations Prestiti. But here's where it gets interesting. Venice created something unprecedented, a system for tracking and transferring these obligations. There were no physical certificates. Instead, the government maintained a public registry through officials called the Ufficiali degli Prestiti. Every creditor's name was recorded. Every payment was documented. And crucially, ownership could be transferred. If you held Prestiti and needed cash, you could sell your claim to someone else. The registry would be updated, and the buyer would receive all future payments as if they'd been the original creditor. This was revolutionary. Risk became transferable. Liquidity was born. Lending to the government wasn't a trap. It was an investment that could be bought and sold. By the late 1200s, Venice had a functioning secondary market for government debt. Prices were publicly available. Nobles traded prestiti as part of their daughters' dowries. Charities used them as endowments. People bought them to fund retirements. The bond market emerged from Venice's lagoon. Now, the system had unusual features that would seem bizarre today. Most obviously, these were forced loans. Venice didn't ask if you wanted to lend. They assessed your wealth and told you how much you owed. This wasn't optional. There's something darkly ironic here. Citizens actually preferred forced loans to higher taxes. They would rather be compelled to lend money they might get back with interest, than simply be taxed and receive nothing. The prestiti were also perpetual, no maturity date. The government wasn't obligated to repay principal by any specific time. They just had to keep making interest payments forever. When flush with cash during peacetime, Venice would buy back Prestiti on the open market. But bondholders couldn't demand repayment. Modern governments still issue perpetual bonds. Britain's famous consuls worked the same way. The structure Venice created didn't disappear. It evolved. In 1262, Venice consolidated all its outstanding debt into a single fund called the Monte Vecchio, the Old Mountain. This standardized everything. A fixed 5% interest rate paid semi-annually, clear rules about registration and transfer, and crucially, dedicated tax revenue earmarked to pay bondholders before the government could claim anything else. Venice established that bondholders had legal priority. The government could keep only the first 3,000 lire monthly for itself. Everything beyond that serviced the debt first. This wasn't just a promise, it was a binding structure that created confidence. For over a century, from 1262 to 1377, Venice paid its 5% without interruption. No defaults, no missed payments. In a medieval world where royal promises meant nothing, Venice's Prestiti became the safest investment in Europe. They were, for their time, what treasury bonds are today. But here's where the story changes. Venice was constantly at war. With Genoa, with Hungary, with Milan, with the Ottoman Turks. Each war required new forced loans. Each new loan increased supply, and each increase pushed down prices. By 1285, Prestiti had fallen to 75% of face value. By 1299, after a devastating naval defeat to Genoa, yields spiked above 8% as prices collapsed. The worst came during the War of Chioggia in 1378. Venice imposed massive assessments, suspended interest payments entirely, and stripped Prestiti of their tax exemptions. Bond prices crashed to 19% of face value. 19%. A bond worth 100 ducats at par was now worth 19. Venice eventually recovered. But the pristine credit record that took a century to build was tarnished. Over the following centuries, Venice's debt mountain kept growing. When the Monte Vecchio became too depressed, they created the Monte Nuovo in 1482. When that collapsed, the Monte Nuovissimo in 1509. Then the Monte di Sussidio in 1526. Each new mountain of debt was created because the previous mountain had crumbled. By the early 1500s, original Monte Vecchio bonds traded at under 10% of face value. And yet, the system persisted. The basic innovation? Tradable government debt with registered ownership and regular interest payments spread throughout Europe. Genoa adopted it. The Dutch refined it. Britain created consuls. And eventually, the United States issued treasury bonds working on principles Venice established 800 years ago. So what does this mean for us? When the U.S. Treasury auctions billions in government bonds, when investors analyze yield curves, when pension funds park assets in sovereign debt, they're participating in a system that began with a catastrophic military defeat in the 12th century. The Venetians didn't set out to revolutionize finance. They faced an immediate crisis, an angry mob, an empty treasury, debts they couldn't repay, and they improvised. That improvisation became one of the most consequential inventions in economic history. But here's the uncomfortable truth the Venetian story reveals. Government debt is a promise. The value of that promise fluctuates based on trust. When Venice was winning wars and running surpluses, Prestiti traded near par. When Venice was losing and piling on debt, prices collapsed. Nothing about this has changed. The bond market is still a referendum on government credibility. When yields spike and prices fall, investors are saying, "We're not sure you can pay this back." When yields compress and prices rise, investors are saying, "We trust you." Venice learned that trust, once damaged, takes decades to rebuild. They learned that forced lending erodes confidence, even when it fills the treasury. They learned that perpetual debt can become a perpetual burden. These are not ancient lessons. These are the dynamics playing out in bond markets right now. We like to think we've advanced beyond medieval finance. We have computers and derivatives and central banks. But the fundamental equation hasn't changed since 1172. A government that borrows must convince people to trust its promise. And that trust, like the Venetian Doge learned when the mob caught up with him, can evaporate in an instant. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.